A very, very good afternoon to you. My name is Howard Feldman. I'm the head of marketing and of people at Synthesis Technologies. In my spare time, I'm a talk show host for the Morning Mayhem. I'm a weekly columnist on News 24 and at the South African Jewish Report. And I've written a few books, some of which are better than others. Why am I telling you this? Is because through these medium, I am awarded a unique insight into what people are feeling and what they are dealing with in terms of COVID-19. The virus that has been unleashed upon the world has impacted on every aspect of our lives. There is not an industry, there is not a social interaction that has been untouched. And there's hardly an assumption that we can make about how things will operate post-lockdown. We might have a view, and we might even be correct. But if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that theories be damned. The only thing we know for certain is how little we know. Welcome to the Synthesis Symposium. Our goal this afternoon is to provide context and insights, as well as options into the new world. We don't profess to have all of the answers, but even without the foresight of being able to anticipate this black swan, as a company, we've been preparing for this for some time. To borrow a technology phrase, it's coded into the culture of the company. Our agenda this afternoon is as follows. We're going to begin with an insight by renowned COVID expert, pulmonologist, Dr. Anton Myburgh. He's been at the forefront of the battle against the pandemic here in South Africa. Following that, we're going to take a look at an economic forecast and analysis by Synthesis Managing Director, Michael Shapiro. Jake Shepard will take us on a journey of how technology can be used for good, and Tom Wells will speak on the need to innovate when we have little choice. Finally, lead cloud analyst Darren Back will talk to the cloud-saving imperatives. We are going to allow questions between each presentation. You can submit them on the live chat that accompanies this webinar, and I'm going to put them to the speakers. We're going to leave around about 5 minutes after each presentation for questions. We're also going to ask you to participate in a number of polls, so do keep an eye on them and keep involved or get involved if you wish to do that. After that, at the end, we invite you to stay online so that you can chat in this forum to any of the presenters. I'm thrilled and excited to get going on this 2-hour journey that I'm hopeful is going to open up new avenues for you and for us all. Before we begin, I do want to thank my incredible team, Kim, Belinda, Sharon, and Jared, who have worked tirelessly to help to put this together. Dr. Anton Myburgh, pulmonologist and physician in private practice, good afternoon and welcome. Are we winning the war against this pandemic?
So good afternoon, and thanks for having me on this webcast this afternoon. It's a very good question. Are we talking globally or are we talking locally? I think we need to look at the numbers. And the numbers at this point in time, currently we're sitting on 3,028,031 cases worldwide with 212 deaths. South Africa itself has got 4,793 cases with 90 deaths. And at the moment, we've tested about 178,000 cases in the country. If we take it more local, if we look in Gauteng, there's about 1,331 cases in Gauteng, and even closer to home, if we take it to Johannesburg, there's about 788 cases in Johannesburg. We've now been in lockdown for about 5 weeks, and we've definitely flattened the curve. That was the whole point of this lockdown, was to flatten the curve, to make hospitals ready, to get people ready, and to slow down the virus spread. So at this point in time, we are winning the battle. And I think there's a very important point we need to make. We're probably the only country in the world with a negative death rate. And what does that mean? And we know we've got 90 cases, but if you look at the Easter weekend and the fact that there were hardly any deaths over the Easter weekend compared to normal times, If you look at any of the public hospitals like Baragwanath, Joburg, Gen, the number of trauma cases is down dramatically. So the number of deaths are down dramatically due to no alcohol, due to less people driving on the roads. So yes, we're at a negative death rate, even though we do have a few deaths at this point in time.
Are we ready to go back to work?
So that's an economic and a health question. From an economic point of view, I don't think we've got a choice. From a health point of view, I think we are. And I'll say that because the hospitals are now ready. We've all got wards in our hospital that are dedicated to COVID-19. We've got ICUs, we've got general wards. All of the casualties are set up to facilitate people coming into the hospitals that can triage patients with a cough, with a fever, anyone who's got any symptoms. Someone's known as a PUR, which is a person under investigation, comes in and gets triaged into the hospital. So we are ready to go down to level 4. But I think people got to understand it's still lockdown. Doesn't mean that because we're going down one level that everyone can go back to normality. There's no normality at this point in time. So as a few of the more relevant services will be going on now, and a few more people from the workforce can go back to work, we still are in level 4 lockdown.
Can you give us a sense of where we are in terms of treatment here in South Africa and around the world? I know there's lots of talk about experimental drugs, about using different protocols. Where are we with that?
So the important thing to understand is not one of these treatments have been proven or peer-reviewed because we're still too early into this virus. So all the treatments that we're using are basically treatments that have been tried and tested by doctors in the field at the moment, but there are not enough studies going out to show that they can be peer-reviewed. The most important drug that we're using at the moment is something called remdesivir, which is an antiviral. There's different classes of drugs, and antivirals are the most important because this is the virus. So remdesivir binds to the RNA part of the virus and helps treat the virus. The important thing of remdesivir was it was used in the Ebola virus as well as SARS and MERS, which were a number of years ago, with great efficacy. It's now being used in the later stage of the coronavirus patients who are in ICU, who are extremely ill, who've got a hyperimmune inflammatory response. Other drugs that we're using are drugs that you've heard about from Donald Trump and all over the world, like chloroquine. Chloroquine was an anti-malarial drug. It's used in patients with arthritis and other inflammatory conditions. It's used together with things like azithromycin, which is an antibiotic as well. It's used for its antiviral effects. We do know that it has got side effects and it cannot be used in its singularity and shouldn't be used by people at home on their own niche, but it should be used under controlled environments and used in people to try and help them. There's lots of in vitro tests and a few in vivo tests that are being done at the moment to show the efficacy, but we're working on things like that. Another big problem that people develop whilst they're in ICU is clotting factors. They can have strokes, they can have pulmonary emboli, they can have myocardial infarctions. So anticoagulation, that's blood thinners, are very important in this whole treatment. We're also trying things like immunoglobulins to help boost the immunity, which might help in the hyperinflammatory phase of the treatment, as well as things like zinc and vitamin C. Vitamin C is an antioxidant, and zinc helps in inhibiting the replication of the viral RNA. We're also using drugs like tocilizumab, which is an interleukin-6 inhibitor, which is a monoclonal antibody which is used in rheumatoid arthritis. And we're trying all these different types of drugs to try and see if they work together to try and help people. Other antiviral drugs are things like Eluvia, which is lopinavir and ritonavir, which hasn't had much success by itself, but it is being used together with other drugs to try and help dampen the viral response. So we've got a lot of things that we're using. Japan have got a few other things that they're using. Apinagab, there's a few other things that are being tried and tested. But at this point in time, the one thing we're waiting for is the vaccine. We need the vaccine to treat people so we can get herd immunity and get people better that way. And we've got to wait for that to come out.
The symposium is dealing with what happens post-lockdown primarily from a business perspective. When we go back to work, assuming that whoever's on this webinar, some people will be going back immediately, some people will be perhaps trying to work from home. What is going to be expected of us when we enter our work environment?
So ideally, if you're going to a large working environment, even a smaller working environment, we would hope that people have got thermometers or temperature gauges to measure people's temperature before they come into the office. It's very important that if your temperature is raised, it's above 37.7 or 37.8, closer to 38, you shouldn't be allowed to come to work and you should be told to go home. People need to wear masks. It's mandatory now in the country to wear a mask. We're talking about cloth masks, whether they're triple-layered or not, you need to wear a mask. And people have to adhere to the social distancing and the strict lockdown procedures, even though they're going back to work. So in other words, you should be 1.5 to 2 meters away from everybody, and you need to use your hand sanitizers, your alcohol rubs, and wash your hands continuously throughout the day. If you touch a lift, trying to open up the lift going inside, use your hand sanitizer straight away. If you open a door, use your hand sanitizer or try use your elbow to push the door open. But in terms of being inside an office, you need to have social distancing inside the office, and all the people inside the office need to wear masks continuously while they're around each other. Remember, it's a droplet spread virus. It's not an aerosol, but it's droplet spread. So if I'm less than 1.5 meters away from you and I sneeze or cough, I can spread the virus to you. So it's very important that we wear our masks in that type of environment and wash our hands and keep that social distancing.
All right. And finally, how long do you think COVID-19 is going to be around?
So the academics have said that we're expecting a peak between July and August, up until September. It's very much dependent on the development of the vaccines worldwide. A lot of the epidemiologists have stated that they think the vaccines are only going to be available within a year. But Israel and the United Kingdom and America have already started virus and vaccine testing on people. They started first phase of the trials. And I think they're ramping this up and they're trying to expedite these vaccines to come a lot quicker. We're hoping people will develop herd immunity. And I think the important thing is to know is that people who are going back to work should be healthy people. It shouldn't be people over the age of 65 who've got comorbidities, who've got diabetes, who've got hypertension, who've got COPD. The healthy workforce, the young workforce must go back to work that are necessary to work at this point in time, so that if they do get sick, they've got strong immunities and they've got the ability to fight infection and hopefully be asymptomatic with the infection. And that's another reason why you've got to wear masks, because 20% of the population will be asymptomatic with this virus. So you do not know that if someone's well and they come to the office and cough or sneeze on you, that they could be transferring the virus to you. So therefore, you have to do your hand sanitization, you have to do your social distancing, and you have to take care of yourself. And by taking care of yourself, you're taking care of your colleagues at the same time.
All right, a question from Justin. He says Sweden is taking the herd immunity route. Can you comment on this versus the lockdown route?
So I think it's a common misconception about what Sweden are doing, because although the government have said they're taking the herd immunity, there still is lockdown, and it's a voluntary lockdown that's occurring in Sweden at the moment. They are number 20 in the world for number of cases and number of deaths that they've got at the moment. So there are people that are self-isolating themselves, which is the majority. The majority of people are not using public transport, and the majority of people are staying away from public gatherings. The government has said that no more people can go to a gathering if there's 50 people or more. So I think it's quite a misconception, this. And I do believe that people actually need to realize that they're not just doing the herd immunity. But I think if you look at other countries like Israel, where they've now sent the younger people back and the workforce back from that respect, they're trying to develop more of a herd immunity now, with the younger people hopefully getting sick. It's the same thing as with measles. You know, you need about 70 to 90% of the population to be vaccinated against a virus to develop herd immunity. So you can't expect the population to have a herd immunity unless everyone is exposed. And it's going to take time for herd immunity to develop in a totality until the vaccines arrive.
All right. That is unfortunately all we have time for as far as the COVID update itself, the medical is concerned. Dr. Myburgh, thank you as always. You make yourself available to us every day for an update, as well as every Sunday for a Sunday podcast. We're going to keep doing those. We do post them every week to all of our social media channels, and we thank you for the incredible work that you're doing, as well as constantly updating and keeping us informed. So thank you, and we will certainly speak again with you on Sunday. Moving across or moving along, Michael Shapiro is the managing director of Synthesis Technologies. He's going to be looking at what is the new normal. Is there a new normal? And how is business going to look post the lockdown? Michael. Right, if this was on radio, we'd probably be cutting to ads at this point, but hopefully Mike will be moving into the screen. There we go.
Thanks, Howard, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in to this webinar and to this symposium. Really appreciate people taking the time out and joining us. We're learning as we go along as well. So we're not experts. Anton certainly is a medical expert, and we appreciate his input and giving us information and keeping us at peace. But we're trying our best. The title of my presentation is the new normal, how business may look post-COVID-19 lockdown. I think how it will look, no one really knows. And we're making some assumptions, and we're basing our feedback and our view on some of the past experience that we've had with other crises, all the way back to, say, 2008. One thing is certain: people are looking for positive change. There's going to be a top-down enforcement of a whole bunch of rules and regulations, travel restrictions, hygiene at the workplace, social distancing restrictions, which will be really quite quite onerous. And also, we're going to be facing people having behaviors and having habits that, while they're working at home and while they're under lockdown, will take root. Things like access to everything digital, and e-commerce being the primary way that people want to obtain goods and services. So that bottom-up embracement is also another facet that will be quite interesting to see how it plays out, these two various forces. What is also quite scary is that what we're seeing now is rapid unemployment on the rise. The graph there shows US unemployment rates, which have skyrocketed in a very short space of time. But what will happen post that is something that we can't postulate, because there'll be a number of different aftershock events, things like bankruptcies and potentially bailouts. And in South Africa, we do have some bailout funding, but not to the extent that some of our more developed countries will have. So it's not going to be easy for us to go back. One example is, for instance, beer consumption. Restaurants are closed down, sporting events are not taking place. So what will that do to beer consumption? Even though they're not directly affected, no one knows what these aftershock events may be. But it's not all bad news, specifically for us South Africans. As part of our citizen DNA, very important facets that are going to help us through this crisis, as we've had in the past. Through many other crises, we've learned to be resourceful. And South Africans certainly have that capability. We're also resilient. We've been through a lot. And this stands us in very good stead. And some people might say, I'm not correct by saying South Africans are optimistic, because we do seem to moan a lot and complain a lot. However, there was a global study done last year, and it listed South Africans as being optimistic. In fact, 64% of people surveyed viewed themselves as optimistic. That is higher, actually 8% higher than the global average. So all of these factors do play in well for us coping with this crisis. And we're in the same boat as everyone else globally. So we have some of these factors that may help us, even though we have some others that are probably, we're at a disadvantage. So what will it look like? I've done some research, and Clem Center, who people may remember, is the famous futurist and strategy commentator who came up with various strategies during the 1994 transition of power to the ANC government. He listed a whole bunch of scenarios, and one of them was his scenario where he said the high road that South Africa could face would be where there's a negotiated political transfer of power. And that turned out to be the scenario that was correct, thankfully. He's looked at various scenarios of how the COVID-19 post-lockdown effects could turn out. He wrote an article on the 10th of March, so quite outdated information, which he then updated on the 20th of April. So in his first article, he laid out 3 various scenarios. In his first scenario at the time, he called Much Ado About Nothing. And I think everyone agrees that this isn't like the Y2K problem. This is a real problem. There are hundreds of thousands of deaths. This is a major situation that's facing everyone on the globe. So that first scenario, in his later article, he admitted is not a real likely outcome. The remaining 2 scenarios that he painted were something called the camel's straw. And that's that proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, where he said, in fact, the pandemic won't be as serious as medical experts make out, but the effect on the economies globally is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. After years and years of increases, one contagion would be the only thing that would be needed to collapse these economies. And even though from a health perspective, the countries would be survive, there'd be a detrimental effect to economies, and that would be the camel's straw scenario. The third scenario, he referenced the Spanish flu outbreak in 1918, where approximately 3 to 5% of the world's population died during that pandemic. He called this scenario Spain again. That's where countries ignore the health warnings, don't implement social distancing, aren't prepared from a medical perspective, and we land up, unfortunately, having a very serious outcome as per the epidemic in Spain. On the 20th of April, he updated this and said, in fact, the 4th scenario is the one that he's most hopeful for, where he calls it the tightrope. So it's a matter of deciding between the calculus of how many lives are lost or how many livelihoods are compromised. And this is a very difficult tightrope. And in fact, we'll probably see this between governments debating on how they treat the epidemic and the pandemic. We'll see this at a corporate level. How do companies face the difficult choices that lie ahead of us? And in fact, we'll probably have to face these choices as individuals. Do we go out? Do we attend a function? Do we stay home? Do we acknowledge and do we respect the full social distancing regulations? So all of us are going to be walking this tightrope, either on a micro level or at a community level or even at a national level. And that's something that he postulated that would be most important, that corporations need to walk this tight balancing act between the camel's straw and between the Spain again outlook. So somewhere down the middle. And I think, as Dr. Myberg pointed out in his earlier podcast, South Africa is almost at this crossroads now, where we're going to be moving from the level 5 lockdown rules to a level 4 to open up the economy. And through the economic advisors and health advisors, we're going to try and navigate this very, very, very difficult road ahead. So what does that mean for businesses? So there are a number of opportunities or a number of new technology and new innovations that are available to companies. And what we've seen in the past is sometimes behavioral change would take a while before a new product is launched. But in the last 6 or 7 weeks, we've seen some major shifts as a result of being in lockdown. For instance, Formula One organization, a massively attended event and viewed event globally, has switched to e-driving and has allowed the drivers to actually participate. So they have ensured that they can continue with some of their advertising revenues. Another major change will be in healthcare, where we see a move towards e-healthcare through devices such as IoT wearables and even chatbots that will help patients through their diagnosis and maybe even prescription stages, as it becomes more and more difficult to attend hospitals and places where the virus is potentially more prolific. A third area where we'll see a significant amount of changes is something that Synthesis has been pioneering for the last period, and that's contactless payments. The World Health Organization has requested a move to contactless payments, a move away from cash. And that poses some very interesting challenges in South Africa, where we have a significant portion of our population that are underbanked, and the majority of them in a cash-based society. So how do we move and how do we pivot across to these new technologies? And each industry will have to work out and find the best way to actually traverse these steps. We'll also notice many shifts in human behavior. Majority of us locked down at home have created home offices, but we'll probably see the advent of a change in working from home. It won't be a simple screen and keyboard with access to services on the cloud. We'll move perhaps to more augmented reality type of solutions where we can sit and interact with colleagues, or we can have a board meeting where we'll actually be able to view the people that are sitting around us and interact with them. In fact, certain conferences are moving that way using augmented reality. We'll also see the advent of 3D printing. As I mentioned earlier, the change and shift in people's behaviors will mean that people will be more comfortable with e-commerce, and perhaps 3D printing will allow people to view products before they buy them or view a sample of a product. It could also revolutionize and change the way that manufacturing can take place in remote locations. So these shifts in human behaviors are going to be really interesting to watch and to see how they play out. Also, during this lockdown period, there's been a huge amount of support and advertising for people to gain new skills while they're not fully productive. And evidence has shown that once the economy opens up and catches on again, and we've seen these cycles many times in the past, and most economists, they can't predict when it will happen, but they're saying that the economy will open up again. And these skills that people pick up and obtain during this time period will become invaluable. At the corporate level, there's going to be a significant shift in the way people think and the way people have to operate during this crisis. So this is some data that was taken from the 2008 global financial crisis and how companies that came out of that really well responded during that crisis. The first graph shows that while it's important and it's advocated to actually drop capital expenditure during these difficult times, companies that invested in R&D landed up becoming very innovative companies post the recession. And those investments today are paying off, as evidenced on the graph on the right, which is Gartner research, which shows that of Fortune 1000 companies that accelerated R&D spending during the global financial crisis, they're actually landed up being far more profitable. The graph there in the black shows the EBIT numbers compared to their peers in the Fortune 1000 group. And those companies were far more profitable. Yes, they did implement cost cutting, but at the same time, they invested in business opportunities that would help them grow post the financial crisis. So we're hoping that the same holds true during this crisis now. And as we come out of lockdown, we're looking at these post-lockdown exit strategies. What are we at Synthesis doing? We're trying to understand these new markets and our role that we can play in them. We have some very unique technical skills, and we're busy trying to define what our purpose or what our product and service offering could be to create this novel business idea. We're then going to analyze the addressable market and do the standard entrepreneurial steps to actually bring that product to market. We're going to look at the competition. And most importantly, as we've done in the past, and as Howard mentioned up front, we've been preparing for this, albeit unaware that the extent or even that this pandemic would hit us in such force, but that we're prepared to be able to create defensible and differentiated product offerings. As you can see from the bottom, all of this is underpinned from our cultural view to how we are agile and how we adapt to changes. The Pac-Man who's taken the power pill is culture, and culture, as we often say, eats strategy for breakfast. So with the support of our executive, our holding company, Capital Appreciation, which is a JSE-listed entity, has allowed us to free up time and resources to focus on these novel business ideas, to see how we can go forward in this very uncertain and uncharted territory. Looking forward, we have a number of different initiatives, and these are underpinned by 4 pillars. The first one was advice that our capital appreciation executive gave our team, is that not only do we need to empathize and understand what's happening with our staff, but we need to empathize with our customers. And immediately we reached out to them, and we're still doing that and asking them how they're coping with the lockdown. Is there anything that Synthesis as a service provider can do to assist them? We have lots of skills in remote working. We also are able to support infrastructure remotely, as we've been doing in our 20-year history. And can we help them right now enable some of these stress points that are plaguing them? Secondly, we have a product that supports contactless payments, and we're going to be aggressively marketing that, not only in South Africa, but also abroad, to support some of these new changes in behavior. Thirdly, we're looking at the healthcare segment. Historically, we've been focused on financial services, and that's been really our customer base. But the healthcare sector can certainly use some of the digital services and some of the innovations that we have brought to bear. And we're underway already with an initiative looking at digitizing healthcare sign-on and how to fill out application forms, which are proving to be really tedious and against everyone's best interest to actually ensure quicker response rates. Finally, we're looking at offshore opportunities. With the volatility in the South African rand, we are looking through some of our historic partnerships and forays overseas into some US dollar income with rand-based costs. So we're trying to galvanize ourselves in these tough situations and move forward on the basis of some of these new business opportunities. I'd like to end off with a short quote which has been attributed to Charles Darwin, which states that it's not the strongest of the species that survives, or certainly not the most intelligent, but it's the one that is adaptable to change. And I think this is really sage feedback for companies as they exit this lockdown, and for individuals as they look for business opportunities and how to remain relevant in these really challenging times. So I thank you all for attending this seminar. We'll open up for some questions as we navigate and traverse through this very, very scary tightrope of between the camel's straw scenario or between the Spain again scenario. We really want to avoid each of those scenarios, and it's going to be up to us to take that forward.
Michael, thank you. A question that popped to mind whilst you were talking is that a lot of what you were saying is actually quite counterintuitive, because whilst we worry about ourselves during lockdown and our own immediate environment, actually the answer is to look to your staff, look to customers and empathize with them. Whilst our tendency is obviously to cut costs at all wherever possible, what you're saying actually is this is a time of innovation and to some extent expansion. It appears to be counterintuitive.
So yes, it is counterintuitive, and the research bears it out. I'm advocating cost cutting, and I am advocating being cautious and being financially prudent. But at the same time, I think companies that want to prosper post this lockdown and post the uptick in the economy have to be investigating new ways of doing business, new opportunities that may present themselves based on their core competencies. So while, yes, on the surface it looks counterintuitive, actually, if you look at the research and if you think about it, this is actually quite sound advice and actually a strong way to actually come out of this. Is it 6 months? Is it 1 year? I think that's part of
my next question to you is when do you think we will ever go back to business as we have known it? Will we ever?
It's really hard to say, but I mean, what's interesting is you look at the 1918 news article. There was of the Spanish flu. There was advice on how to make a cloth mask. That was 1918. And history repeats itself, and we do have these cycles. And yes, a few years later, people do bounce back. I mean, they went through the Great Depression in the 30s. I can't call it. I'm not an economist. But certainly we will get back to what will be a new normal. Things will be very different. But I think there will be a time where businesses equalizes and the economies start growing again at healthy rates.
Peter wants to know, I see a lot of conversation around how business can navigate the pandemic. How do we help NGOs and cultural organizations to navigate, as they certainly will have to lay off staff?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at Synthesis, we're looking at those initiatives. So as part of our corporate social investment, looking at funding through some of our partners that are at grassroots level, providing food, providing meals, some really interesting opportunities, and technology can play a part. So any company, doesn't need to devote funding to these NGOs, and they do need funding, but also time and also donations in kind can certainly help. So whatever company a person is part of, that will certainly benefit an NGO and will certainly benefit much needed charitable organizations that are going to be under more and more pressure and are actually finding it really difficult to operate in the lockdown environment. So reach out to them and ask them, is my advice.
Exactly right. All right, Michael, we're going to leave it there at the moment. We'll come back to you towards or right at the end. Thank you for, in fact, hold on before I do let you go. No, this is a question for a little bit later. Oh no, hold on. Here we go. Is the new guy wants to know? Isn't the new normal just a different way of saying different?
The new normal, look, it is very different. I mean, no one, even Clem Center, who's seen a lot, he said if you wrote, and he wrote an article in November last year and spoke about global pandemics being potentially one of the game-changing events. But he said if you wrote his scenario, the camel straw scenario, at the beginning of February, everyone would have laughed at him. How could the global economy collapse? How could we have a third of the population under lockdown and unemployment spiral in the USA? So I think it is very different. So yes, the new normal isn't just different. It's extremely different.
And the point is that you have to get used to it, which is why it's kind of spoken about as the new normal and not just being different, because it's just the way things are going to be. Michael Shapiro, Managing Director of Synthesis, thank you. We'll come back to you in a short while. Jake Shepherd is a co-founder and the technical director at Synthesis. And in fact, he's going to be talking about using technology for good. So that question around NGOs actually is a perfect segue into what you want to share with us, Jake. Good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. So first of all, I'd like to just welcome and thank everybody for joining us at the Synthesis Symposium. Let me first start off by apologizing for those people who might have been misled by the title of this talk into expecting me to talk about transformative technologies and how it's being used today to address the issues that society is facing. Instead, I want to actually channel Lance Armstrong and his book, It's Not About the Bike, and tell you it's not about the technologies. And what I mean by that is obviously Lance Armstrong was there using the latest bike technologies that were available at the time. I suppose also a little bit EPO also didn't harm, but also so the technology companies themselves. What we need to do is we also need to use the latest technologies. Sure, we need to use the latest software platforms, use the latest tools, cloud, artificial intelligence, machine learning, containerization, container orchestration, streaming. All of those are important, but ultimately It's not about the technology. So really, then what is it about? So let's go back to basics. Everyone in business knows that unless you're delivering a service that others want to pay for, you'll very quickly go out of business. Let me just see if the slide's not changing. It's not changing. Oh, you know what? Right. Sorry. Get this. Can you see the mouse?
Yes.
Click on the thing. Click on your thing. Go for it. Sorry about that.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to basics. Everyone in business knows that unless they're delivering a service that somebody else is prepared to pay for, the chances are they are going to go out of business. And we see this with a lot of startup companies. So they've got a great idea, they've got a novel approach, and they think it's really sexy. Unless they can find a market, unless they can monetize that idea, it's not going to work. So we need to then ask ourselves the question, what happens if the shape of that value space changes? So we all know that change is inevitable and that tomorrow is going to be different than it is today. So what we really have to understand that the current corona crisis and the rest of what we normally think of situation normal, the difference is that rate of change. And normally change is fairly slow, so you've got time to adapt, and you can think of it as an evolutionary type of cycle. I think what's happening today is it's more of a revolution as opposed to an evolution. And as with any other revolution, there are consequences to that, and there's a lot of fallout, and a lot of people, businesses and people actually, have a really difficult time at a time like this. So there are really two ways of looking at this period of time. And I want to suggest that one way of looking at now and then the time coming ahead is to one way of looking at it is hibernation. It's effectively, so you're in lockdown now, and eventually things are going to turn out to be normal eventually. So after a few months, after maybe even a year, things will eventually turn back to normal. And I want to say, actually, that's a mistake. It's far better to look at this period of time as a period of time of metamorphosis. And what I mean by that is when we come out of the cocoon of lockdown, not only will the world look different, but we ourselves are going to be fundamentally changed by the whole experience. So one example of this, Synthesis has never thought of itself as a remote working company. And I think we'd always have our teams, we've mandated that people who had to work at either the clients and go on-site at clients, or they'd be working from our offices. And what's actually happened is now all of a sudden, with the lockdown, we've realized that Synthesis can do remote work, and it's actually incredibly effective. And I think what's going to happen is if all knowledge worker-based companies, like banks and other companies, start realizing that this is the case, what's that going to do to the commercial property companies when they've got nowhere to, people don't want to necessarily rent as much space as they used to? I'm sure most people would prefer the model of hibernation. But I think what we need to understand is we need to be realistic and accept reality, that it's going to be a metamorphosis and that things are actually going to be different. So it's not really how we do. The question isn't how we do what we're doing. The question you should really be asking is, how will we be doing what we are doing in a different world? That's really it. And we need to start asking ourselves not the question, will we have a job, but will my job still be relevant going forward? So one example, common example, I suppose, in the education environment, you've got students all across the entire world who are experiencing self-paced learning and online learning. And in that situation, you've got to be starting to ask yourself the question, teachers standing up in front of a classroom, isn't that whole world going to be disrupted? So my advice to teachers in that scenario is really to tune in to your why. Why is it that you teach? And one way you could actually think of it is maybe you teach because I want to inspire tomorrow's leaders, or I want to actually grow the potential in people. I want to be that. So maybe that's why you teach, and that's really important to tune into your why. It actually creates a much bigger space within which you can operate. And then go about and saying, well, how can I do that? How can I achieve that why by doing something slightly different? So what I might be doing is I might be saying, all right, let's go see what makes a compelling presentation. How do I create videos, with insightful content, and start learning by doing. And then from our perspective, from a technology industry perspective, the question we should be asking ourselves is, well, how do we enable teachers to do that going forward? So how do we take the teaching industry and how do we revolutionize that to enable the teachers to be able to do that distance learning? And if we come up with a compelling answer to that question, then maybe we're actually going to be playing a significant role in the online education space. Now, I'd like you to imagine asking and answering that question for every single business area that is going to be affected by the current crisis. So what I firmly believe is that this period of time that we're living through right now is going to be looked back as a period of time of tremendous innovation, transformation, creativity, and it's going to be an opportunity for the entire technology industry. So the only questions we now have to ask are, is my company ready to take advantage of this? And secondly, how quickly can I move? Because first mover advantage is everything. So in life, or in game theory, there are two types of games. There are finite games and there are infinite games. And finite games, they're fairly easy games. They're games where we know the rules, we know the players are, and really the aim of the game is to win and not to lose. So we have lots of examples of that: chess, soccer, poker. These are all finite games. Infinite games are incredibly different. It's chalk and cheese. In infinite games, we know what some of the rules are. We don't know all the rules. In fact, we know some of the players, but we don't know all of the players. And really, the whole goal of an infinite game is to realize that you need to set the thing up in such a way that what will happen is that you can continue playing the game. And a good example of an infinite game is marriage. So the aim is not to win marriage. If one spouse tries to win the game of marriage, the other spouse is then losing the game of marriage, then you're no longer playing the game of marriage. You're now playing a new game called the game of divorce. So really, marriage as a game is really, how do I get to tomorrow still playing the game of marriage until death do us part? And that's a good example of an infinite game. And I first heard about this concept from the author Simon Sinek in his book, The Infinite Game. And he pointed out that business is an infinite game. And the way you know that is because the game of business existed long before all companies in existence today came about. And the game of business will continue long after every single company today has ceased to exist. So the companies that are doing well today, and Simon Sinek points this out, are those companies that have invested in an infinite game mindset. So they've saved up money. They essentially, instead of giving like fat bonuses, instead of using all of their money, they've saved it up. The will of their people is high in order to try and figure out a way through this crisis. So those are the infinite mindset type companies. And in opposition to this, those other companies, the ones that are struggling the most at this point in time, are those that have spent all their money. They haven't saved anything. They've appeased investors through many years, and the will of their people is low. So these companies are really struggling to move out of a survival mode into a reinvention mode. So if you're playing an infinite game, you know that there'll one day come a crisis that we need to weather. So it might not be this year, it might not be next year, but within the next 20 years, the next 30 years, there's going to be a crisis. So that means you need to save now when times are good, not right now, but normally in times are good, for the lean times later. So when playing an infinite game, what you need to do is you need to be guided by vision, by values, and by principles. And I'm not saying that the short-term goals aren't important. They definitely are important. But you have to ask yourself the question, is this short-term expedient decision, it can't be at the consequence or at the detriment to long-term well-being of a company. One way we need to change our way of thinking is the way we judge performance of companies. So many people tell you that the way you judge the performance of a company is through growth or profitability. And other people will say, no, look at the share price. But really, how many people say, look at how stable the company is? How do we measure stability? And yet in the age of Corona, I don't think there's anything more important than stability. And you can ask that by just saying, how much would you give to work at a company today that is stable versus other companies? Many companies have had to make some really, really hard choices about cutting bonuses and reducing salaries. And I think staff are very understanding at a time like this. But I'm just cautioning decision makers to please be hypersensitive to staff and their concerns. It's so easy to destroy trust at a time like this. You know, people have really long memories, and it is so easy, and they will remember, you know, how was I treated when the chips were down? So you really need to be careful, and it's not just for staff, but it's also for suppliers, and it's for clients, the same thing, because you might survive, but then at what cost? So another thing, it's critical to create a sense of certainty. And I know it's difficult given the constraints, you know, that we're facing at the moment, but it's really important because when you create that sense of certainty, you're then allowing your staff to change from a survival mindset to an innovation and a reinvention mindset. And I can tell you now, it's very hard if you don't create that level of certainty. And the next thing you need to do is, so imagine you've got a whole bunch of staff sitting on the bench, and Michael pointed out to this in terms of the R&D. Imagine you've got a whole bunch of staff sitting on the bench. You can either tell them that they're dead weight and they're holding back the business because they're sitting on the bench, or you could look at what projects can you initiate, what skills, like for investment, R&D type investment projects, what skills do my staff need to skill up on to be, you know, participants in this, you know, in this new economy, in this new world that we're going to go into, and invest in that. People, I think it's going to make a tremendous difference. And I think it's only those companies that manage to do this during this time that are going to emerge from this crisis with the ability to take advantage of all these opportunities that are coming down the line. And then create an environment where people feel that others have their back. You know, if people feel that you care for one another, that people care for one another, they're going to sacrifice one another. That's what happens. And the way you do this is by creating a culture of total and utter trust. And it's not that we trust people that they're not going to break the rules. We trust that they know when to break the rules. And with trust comes agility and speed. And that is exactly what you need to adjust to the sudden changes that we've been faced with today. And the very opposite of this is a fear-based culture, you know, where people basically live in fear and everyone's scared to break the rules. Because effectively, you know, no one's going to take initiative in a company where everyone's scared to break the rules. And I suppose it's the proverbial deer caught in the headlights of the car. It's going to freeze in fear. Just exactly when it needs to move. So unless you've fostered that culture of trust, it's going to be very difficult to adjust quickly enough for the times ahead. So, but if you have managed to, you know, cultivate that culture of trust, you're going to be able to promote like a flat organizational structure with distributed decision making. And the importance of that is that decision making doesn't become a bottleneck in the organization. There's so many decisions that need to be made now, you can't afford to have bottlenecks there. And then you need also to have an organization with a high tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty. And you know, if you think about it, there's uncertainty gives rise to a lot of fear at the moment. But if you've got a high tolerance for that, you don't have that much fear. And the opposite is true of a company where people expect the leaders to tell them at every step what to do. And then they get upset when they're faced with uncertainty. The next thing is encourage innovation, no matter whose idea it is. You know, you have very, very political cultures where the only ideas that actually come out on top are those ideas where the ideas backed from the top. And I think we need to realize that innovation actually comes from everywhere within the organization. And the only measure for whether an idea is good or not is whether that idea has merit. And it's got nothing to do with the politics. So if it's not about the buck, it most certainly is about resilience. We shouldn't be paralyzed by the inevitable fear of uncertainty that the current crisis has created. We need to move forward, and we need to move forward with purpose and determination. We have to have an eye on emerging stronger and better equipped for the new world awaiting us. And we do this by tuning into our why and what we need to do now in this new world. And we do this by learning from the crisis and not losing this opportunity, this learning opportunity of what the crisis is teaching us, and the fact that we need to adopt an infinite game mindset. So then how does resilience make the world a better place? To me, it is obvious. When people tap into meaning and purpose, then they align what they're doing with what, in terms of what the work's doing, they align with their personal why, and they are inspired and motivated, and they feel that they're making a difference. And when we feel secure about our jobs and we not feeling that we constantly have to update our CV with fear of that retrenchment letter coming through, then we can create, we can innovate. And when we're focused, then we can be focused on building a better tomorrow, and we can be inspired and uplifted. And we also then obviously need to reach out to our clients and tell them that we understand their pain and we actually trying to innovate on their behalf as well. We're trying to think what they can do for this new world as well. And as builders, we need to really listen to the fears and the dreams of our clients, and then dream along with them, and then help them craft their future. So yes, technology is important, and it's going to play an incredibly important role in the future ahead. However, I firmly believe that the real way we rescue our country from the current crisis is by making ourselves, our colleagues, our companies, and our industry as resilient, and our clients as resilient as possible. It is only once we've achieved this resilience that we can use technology to weave its magic and get things done. Thank you. I'm happy to open up to any Q&A that there might be.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, a number of questions. Kim Evans wants to know from us, or from you particularly, do you have any advice for those working in the tourist industry? We know that the tourism industry has been particularly hard hit. How would they, following what you're saying, in terms of maybe looking at their why, what would they do as a process to re-examine a deeply problematic industry?
Yeah, so I think it's a hell of a good question. I don't know if they're as good at answers as the question, but I think if the tapping into the why of tourism is why do people tour? And I think it's because they want a fresh experience. They want to see the world, and they want to see things that they've never experienced before. So in terms of long term, do we see that those new experiences can only be created by physically going to a new place? Or are there other ways of creating new experiences? So if your why as a tourist operator is, I want to facilitate new experiences for people that are my clients, then all of a sudden that why expands the potential area that you can actually create innovations for. So you could start looking at other ways, and it doesn't always have to be technology based, but in terms of 3D virtual reality, those aspects might allow you to start creating some of these new experiences. But that's only if you see yourself as the why for your job, so to speak, is expanding people and showing them new experiences.
Peter wants to know if companies find that they can effectively work remotely in a remote arrangement, is the downsizing of the office space, is that important? What is the significance of office space in any industry that shows that they're capable of working remotely? It's a great question.
It's a great question, and I think we're going to start finding some very interesting answers after the lockdown. And I know just from a synthesis point of view, we've taken extra space. And so now, if we had known now, if we knew now or then what we know now, I think we would have re-examined that whole question, is to what extent could we take part of our workforce and let them work from home? I'm not saying it's obvious. I think there are things that we're missing out on in not being in the office. I think there's the way that you interact, the water cooler talk, a lot of those happenstance meetings, or just connecting with people by and by, just by seeing each other, just a glance across the room. I think we are starting to miss some of that. So I don't think the remote working is a full answer for everything, but I do think it's going to give us a lot more options going forward in terms of space, and a lot more flexibility in terms of catering to people's needs. If they really need to work from home, I think you're going to find that companies are going to be a lot more understanding. Yes, we trust that you can work effectively from home, and yes, we're going to make a plan to help you do that.
Yeah, I see that Laura's commenting. She says, regarding remote working, any advice for staff who simply lack the self-discipline?
Wow. Okay, so I do have some advice for that, and I've got a lot of research into it. Okay, a lot of research into it. You've got to try and mimic the work environment, and what that means is you need to have a schedule. You need to wake up at a certain time. You need to know that you're going to start working at a certain time. Get dressed into work clothes when you're working. Don't stay in your pajamas. Then work through the day, and at the end of the day, transition out of the work environment back into a home environment. So actually have like a desk that is your work area, and that is designated for work. When you're working, you're in that area, and you're in work clothes. When you're out of that area, you're back at home, and you're not in work clothes. So use psychological tricks to help the transition between work and home. And that will actually go a long way to helping you deal with it.
Will the why of education change?
No, the why I think is going to remain the same. If I want to inspire the next generation and I want to actually uplift them and create tomorrow's leaders, if that's your why, I think your why is inevitably can be very, very static. Your why hardly changes. What you do and how you do it is definitely going to change. But the why is the thing that actually remains static. And if your why is too narrowly defined, then you need to just broaden your why and just actually really get to grips with what's the purpose for why you're doing what you're doing.
I love this comment. Pumza says, the human willpower has always been the best technology. The ability of mankind to adapt through different ages and agreeing with Don's postulation will ensure survival beyond this pandemic. Luke says, extra office space after lockdown could be used for high quality people interaction. So lots of very, very, very positive and very interesting comments. Please keep the comments coming. They are important. They help other people as well. So if you would do that, that would be great. And there will be time right at the end to engage further with the presenters on some of these conversations. Jake Shepherd, founder and director at Synthesis, thank you for your presentation. We are now going to be meeting with Tom Wells. He's the Synthesis Chief Innovation Officer, and he's going to be talking about: are we innovating because we have no choice?
Right, awesome. Thank you, Howard. And how's it, everyone on the internet out there? Thanks for joining us today. And hopefully what will be the first of many of these kinds of events. So I wanted to just quickly shout out to Howard, Belinda, Kim, and Jared for putting together a really high quality event. Well done, guys. So the team asked me to talk through our COVID-19 lockdown journey that we've taken at Synthesis to date. And it's obviously a journey that is very much still ongoing, but one that has mostly been positive for us, actually, for a couple of different reasons. Although, absolutely tragic and detrimental COVID will be to most companies, we've made a concerted effort, and I think Mike and Jake maybe have chatted through some of it. We've made a concerted effort to make the most of this time and spend it towards creating new opportunities in our business and within our team and within our structure. So I wanted to talk through some of these opportunities that we see post-lockdown as well. So something that we've thought about for a very long time has been this concept of working from home. And as a software development company, this is something that's actually quite practical. It's absolutely doable. If you look overseas to the US and to Europe, there's a lot of 100% remote software companies. However, in the past, we've always prided ourselves on our very personal approach and our ability to form very tight relationships with our customers. And this question of working from home or remote work seems that would be suddenly throwing this sort of personal touch away. And that shifting to a fully remote model may be quite risky to our business. So, however, it's a topic that we've discussed many times at length, from the boardroom level all the way down to the sort of water cooler and into the corridors, and something that we felt we would need to evolve towards at some stage in our business. And we had lots of support from people at all levels. However, it's a tricky conversation, and one of those things that could be perceived to be quite dangerous. And it's a policy that's potentially quite hard to back out of if it should fail. So, once we would take this leap, we would really need to commit ourselves to make it work. It would have to be embedded as a shared vision amongst our entire team and at all levels. So this has always taken a bit of a back burner in our strategy in the past, something that we believe that we'll have to tackle one day, but not that urgent and not something we aimed for, certainly this year. We've always been a company that experiments. We like to try new ideas, work on them in a sort of limited capacity, learn from our successes and failures, and then pivot to the next experiment. And this process is called validated learning. And it's really something that is part of the synthesis DNA. So this notion of work from home has always been difficult for us, maybe because it's been hard to figure out how to turn it into an experiment. It always felt like an absolute. And as Jake mentioned, it's not a trust thing at all. It's about setting an expectation that's potentially impractical. And we're not sure what the fallout would be once you open Pandora's box. It's just kind of an unknown is how we would call it. So I think that we're lucky in that we understood the risk of potential lockdown quite early, and we were quite quick to begin planning for it. Our goal initially was, when we first met in early March, our goal was not to get our company remote and offsite, but it was to ensure that we were ready for it. This meant that we needed to ensure we had the right leadership structures in place for effective communication, as well as ensure that we had tested remote working tools and processes to ensure it would be a smooth transition if we ever needed to pull the trigger. So from a timeline perspective, we began planning in early March around the topic of readiness. By March the 9th, we had a few small teams optionally working from home. So initially we started out by saying that it was, if teams could work from home, they could optionally work from home, testing the idea, ensuring their process was sound. The milestone for us was holding our first 100% online company team meeting on the 17th of March. And there's a little screenshot of it there, and you can see, I know it's a Microsoft Teams photo, but you can see there's a plus 95 in the corner. I think at one stage we had over 120 people connected to a Microsoft Teams meeting, with every single person being remotely connected. And so by the time that lockdown was announced, we effectively had that last week to close up a few loose ends and be 100% remote within the week of the 23rd. So the plan for us was pretty simple, and simply covered the short, medium, and long-term objectives. The short-term goal was simply executing a project to get the company 100% remote within approximately 3 weeks. And so that project, I would say, is completed. The medium-term objective, number 2 on the list, was to ensure that the company runs efficiently and that staff are productive, happy, are able to work remotely, that the tools work, the processes work during the lockdown period. So I guess that's what we're currently busy with. And then the third part of our plan is really the long-term objective, which is to start planning for what we want the company to look like post-lockdown. Do we return to normal? Do we continue to work from home, or is there some sort of hybrid model? It's probably still early to tell for now, but there's certainly something that we're very much thinking about. To give you some insight into how we tackled the short-term project, we formed what we call the Remote Working Task Force, which was made up of senior members from various areas of the business. Primarily a mix of people to ensure that we had the best coverage for all the teams and individuals from a communications and ops perspective. The first objective, as I already mentioned, was really around assessing the readiness of each team to become remote. And we used a simple 3-tier risk rating that you can see on the right to rate each team. Obviously, it looks like everything is kind of pushed well into the green, but obviously the diagram didn't start like that. We had a lot of teams pushed off to the left, and over time, they slowly moved from the left to the right. The goal of the task force was to ensure that someone would check in with every team during their daily stand-ups every single day and observe and ask questions around those teams' ability to move off-site and whether there were any perceived blockers. A further objective was to provide transparency through to each team of the process that we were currently underway with and deal with any questions or concerns that would arise from potentially teams or individuals or customers or stakeholders. The task force would then meet daily at 3:30 every single afternoon and collectively discuss the issues with a priority on solving those problems that could be then enabled the following day. Our second objective was really to ensure that we could measure any drop in productivity. And this was something that we had a big concern around initially. If you can't measure it, you can't control it. Fortunately, and again, as a software development company, we had long ago made the move to a completely agile software development process. This meant that each team was already responsible for measuring their own outputs and already had a process in place for making those outputs visible. In fact, this was probably one of the areas that was least affected by lockdown. Our core software engineering process based on Agile, plus the fact that almost 100% of the work we do is cloud-based, has meant very little difficulty in the shift to remote work. And I think we're very fortunate for that. Probably the most contentious addition has been that we introduced the concept of timesheets across the board. I'm personally not a fan of timesheets because I feel that productivity should be measured through outputs and not through input hours. But on the other side, I am a big fan of measuring stuff. So this is one of those experiments that's still awaiting validation. However, interestingly enough, when we start to look at our timesheet data now coming in from each individual, we actually don't really see a decline in productivity. What we see is much more key individuals putting in far too much time and potentially overworking. So that's already been valuable already, but time will tell. And so now things are basically running quite smoothly. But one of the things we value very highly is our company culture. And this is one of the things that we focused on preserving. Maybe not so much preserving, but more like evolving. Not being able to sit face to face with your colleagues is really hard. So what we've been trying to do is break down the barriers and get an insight into what our teams are up to. Our marketing and people team have run a number of different challenges, ranging from dress like a superhero, building obstacle courses with their kids, pictures of their workspaces, and even run a number of team building exercises on House Party. And although these are really fun, I really think the value is in getting our teams comfortable with sharing their environments. The more comfortable they are with sharing their environments, no matter what state it's in, the more comfortable they will be with collaborating with others who may have different circumstances. So home used to be this space that was all yours, a private escape from the real world. And I think COVID-19 and lockdown has showed us that that's no longer the case. Home now needs to be a space that you are comfortable with sharing with your work colleagues. And those colleagues need to be understanding of and accepting of all those normal events that occur in home environments, especially, as we all know, sharing your space with kids. So this little BBC thing, I think, will become more and more popular. Another critical part of our ongoing effort has been analyzing what we call happiness data. So this is a tool we built in the middle of last year around the topic of becoming a more data-driven company. And it's a tool that, as I said, that we built internally. We call it Pulse, and it allows us to collect very small and simple data points from each and every individual, either weekly or monthly. Some of the data points we collect are around particular projects, potentially whether they're running well, or whether people have training requirements, or if they feel that they have the requisite skills, whether the customer is happy, whether delivery is on track, all that kind of thing. But one of the very first features we added when we launched Pulse was to ask team members how they were feeling that week. And you can see up on the left that you can submit a variety of options, ranging from ecstatic and cool and wacky, all the way down to the negatives like SOS, overwhelmed, or death. So this data coming in every week helps us gauge any trends that may be surfacing within our teams, but also allows us to pick up on any anomalies within individuals or teams, which can be actioned through appropriate channels. Of course, we've got a number of different initiatives which assist with building a strong employee wellness program, such as mentorship, advocacy, and regular workshops and training. So the Pulse data is certainly not sufficient to assess the overall health, but it's certainly valuable and adds a new dimension we didn't have previously. So this has become a very powerful tool for us actually over the last 2 months, and definitely shows a trend towards the fact that our overall team is under more stress than the prior period. But more importantly, gives us the ability to measure the impact of our controls against a general happiness score. So this is something, so we can kind of see at the beginning of the year, January 2020, it was a new year. There was a lot of mixed emotions coming out of people. I think into February, people started to get into the swing of things, and we saw a lot of ecstatic and very positive sort of vibes. And then actually into the beginning of March, we could see a sharp decline of ecstatic and more into that fine and cool and okay kind of space, with a little bit of meh coming through as well, which is a pretty neutral kind of vibe. So to wrap up, I wanted to mention 3 items that I'm currently thinking about. Firstly, the work from home experiment is underway, and I chatted through that. And so far, looking good. It started with the objective of simply surviving the disruption that's currently occurring. But maybe it'll be something that we look back on and see as a step change in the history of our business. Thankfully, we had been planning for this idea for a while, so it didn't cause as much impact as it could have had we not been prepared. I love the concept of the distributed autonomous organization, and I think this takes one large step towards this. Maybe one day we will reimagine the concept of an organization altogether. The second idea is pretty obvious, I think, and that's really around video and audio. The world has suddenly become very comfortable with the idea of staying at home and doing business via video calling. Of course, this is a highly contested space in social media and the communication space, with platforms like WhatsApp and Zoom and Facebook all fighting for airtime. But I think it wouldn't be too surprising to start to see video capability appearing in other service industries, such as financial services, retail, hospitality, consulting potentially. I think it would be pretty cool to have a video call with my personal banker, sharing the same view of my signed-in browser, while both of us are sitting safely at home in our pajamas. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on a web standard called WebRTC, which is already available and provides browsers with the capability to perform video calling. The other interesting side effect, and something that we absolutely did not see, another interesting side effect of remote work, is that tools such as Microsoft Teams can be set to automatically record and upload virtual meetings into an enterprise content platform. So that content can then be edited and published and reshared across that organization for others to watch. So in the new age of remote work, I think this is actually mandatory now, as without this, we potentially leave a big gap that was previously filled by simple face-to-face conversations in the new office setting. This is also really powerful in the context of training or onboarding of new team members. But it needs to be managed effectively, and content needs to be pruned and edited on an ongoing basis. In a decent-sized organization, I think there is probably enough work here to justify a full-time role or a small team to look after purely curating digital content produced internally. On the flip side, and another interesting dynamic is that I think every knowledge worker now should be measured against their ability to create high quality content. Maybe we all have to become video producers if we're going to be making an impact in our careers. Lastly, and I don't think this should be too surprising, but as we become more sensitive to and make an effort to reduce direct human physical contact, we will need to rely more and more on data-driven and machine intelligence to replace face-to-face that we used to take for granted. So although machines might replace the direct physical channel, and although machines can do a pretty good job of specific tasks, our human ability to be flexible, creative, and use common sense are critical to most businesses. Our challenge is really to figure out that balance when designing the platforms of the future. Thank you very much for listening, and back to you, Howard.
Thanks, Tom. Luann wants to know, is it correct to say that, would you agree with the statement that COVID-19 just fast-forwarded the world to the fourth industrial revolution?
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that's really cool. I think whereas previously, maybe and I'm like not a 4IR specialist, but I think 4IR was something that was potentially like an optional, you could do it in your R&D budget. I think today, like now it's mandatory, right? Like I don't think digital is a choice anymore. I think digital has gone from maybe being like a very close second to being the first with physical second.
A few people are referring to productivity and inefficiency of meetings. Certainly that's something that I found, is that you can't just walk past somebody, greet them, ask them a question and carry on. You set up a meeting and then you're compelled to talk to them for 15 or 20 or minutes or an hour. So certainly I find that my day is much more packed with meetings. What's your thought around that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that we're still in a space where we're discovering how this works. I think the previous interaction mode was walk up to someone at their desk and have a quick conversation and be done with it if it was a fairly small task. Now every single one of those tasks has become this formalized, Microsoft Teams or Zoom meeting. And I think this is, I spend probably 8 hours a day sitting in meetings, and I still have another 8 hours of work that I need to get done. I think we're still, I'm not sure that the technology is there yet. I think we're still figuring out how do we still build those small but meaningful conversations in a digital way. And I'm not convinced that we're there yet.
Yeah, and for busybodies like me who likes to overhear a conversation and then get involved, very difficult, very difficult.
Absolutely. Well, now you're cut out.
Exactly, not easy. And Justin wants to know, what do we do if we see some of our colleagues are not coping very well in this remote working environment? Well, I guess the first thing is, a lot of what you've said is recognizing it, knowing it for sure.
Yeah, I think recognizing, and then I think a whole ton of tolerance. I think we're in a learning phase here, and everyone's situation is very different. No one has manufactured this scenario, right? So like there are some people who are going to thrive, and there are going to be some that are really going to struggle. And I think we've got to give time to the ones that are struggling to figure out what this thing looks like. I think we probably go back to a bit of post-lockdown. Maybe it's a bit more of a hybrid. So people who are more comfortable with the office environment and maybe the more outgoing type of people may gravitate back to a more physical world, whereas the more introverted may choose to tend to be more of a remote work. But I think for now it's an experiment that just has to run its course, and I don't think we can make a decision yet as to what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely. Just as I mentioned, with regard to all of the other panelists, everybody will be available at the end to be able to answer and to get involved in more of these discussions. Tom Wells, Director and Chief Technology Disruptor at Synthesis, thank you for your time and for your presentation. Our final presentation is one that is going to look at cost cutting, efficiencies, and ways to manage this without it being the focus of what companies need to get involved with. There is no doubt that there is a very realistic need for cost cutting, for efficiencies to take place, especially at a time like this. Darren Back is the head solutionist at Synthesis Technologies. Darren, hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. All right, so I would like to chat about the cost-saving imperative. Welcome, everyone. My name's Darren Back. I'm the head solutionist at Synthesis, cloud economic specialist, and a 10Xer. When it comes to cloud adoption or adoption of any technology for that matter, the biggest challenge isn't actually the technology. It's the people and processes that need to change and adapt. Today, I want to show you what the changes required in people to become more cost conscious. I'm sure you've all watched this, lamenting the fact that the Rand has just imploded. And if you're using cloud or any other technology provider that's billed in dollars, you've noticed that your IT spend has just increased too. Your AWS invoice, your cloud invoices are billed in dollars. So you've just seen your costs increase by 30%. The big question is, how do you optimize and reduce that cost, and how do you stabilize the spend to get back to somewhat of a normal? The Rand's implied volatility over 1 and 2 month period is 20%, second only to the Turkish lira in the emerging market basket. The Rand is also the biggest loser, down around 20 to 30%, depending on what day you look at it. And this has just been compounded by the credit downgrade from Moody's. And the bad news, you thought that was the bad news. The bad news is the risk remains skewed for even further weakness, i.e. we could expect a further depreciation in the Rand. All right, so do you need a hedging strategy? Of course you do. I would advise from an AWS perspective to either buy a reserved instances or a savings plan. This is a different pricing model to the pay-as-you-go option or on-demand option, and this allows you to buy capacity for compute upfront, thereby creating a hedge against the depreciation of the Rand. While this is an obvious thing to do immediately, I would argue that operational efficiencies are equally yet or actually more important to focus on. Focusing on a culture of cost transparency and accountability of those application costs by the application team is key. Instilling the value of frugality and stamping out any wasteful spend is very, very important. And finally, promoting that culture of automation. Automate everything. Automate your infrastructure deployments, the way in which you serve up the application through infrastructure as code or CI/CD pipelines. This is the stuff that you should double down and do right away. We have a cloud enablement team at Synthesis who focus on building out safe and secure environments for our application teams to build inside. This is what clients come to us and ask for a landing zone and say, build us something safe and secure. We create a whole bunch of guardrails around it, around security, resilience, etc., but cost too. These team members who then go into an application team are far more cost aware and cost conscious than their application team colleagues. Why? Because they get it. They get that cost is everybody's responsibility. And they realize if you don't focus on costs, your bill will always spiral out of control. So if we focus on what is a savings plan from AWS, and I'd focus on that over reserved instances, primarily because they are less complex and they are more flexible. You're able to select general compute or your EC2 instance. Your EC2 instance is your virtualized server in the cloud, and you can lock into payment terms of 1 or 3 years. There is some trend analysis that you can base this on. So you can ask AWS to recommend what you should be investing in. However, what I would recommend is going onto the pricing calculator and doing some due diligence yourself. You may have created a POC that you know you're not going to be using those instances in the future, and therefore your trends are incorrect. Or you may be expecting a massive spike in year 2, which you can then forecast for. Please select the correct region. The region pricing varies between different regions. And hey, look there, Africa, Cape Town is on the pricing list. For those of you who don't know, the SA region came online last week. Very exciting times, and this is a huge investment into South Africa by Amazon Web Services. They obviously have a soft spot for South Africa, the elastic cloud compute, the EC2 instance, the virtualized server, the real workhorse of the AWS services was created by a small satellite development team in Cape Town. So EC2 has actually come home with its global footprint back in South Africa expanding, and they are now in 23 geographic regions. Actually, they're in 24 because Rome, Italy came online today. What a time for that to happen. Okay, on to the next slide. So now more than ever, apologies, just checking how much time I have. It's you've got to set your own timer these days. Obviously, at a big event, they'll have a countdown for you. Okay, well, now more than ever, we need to focus on optimization, and there are a whole range of things to do. So I'd like to start firstly on the left-hand side and discuss what you should be doing right now, the quick wins. What can you do right away? And then on the right-hand side, some things that you can focus on, generally like app redesign and stuff like that. First and foremost, is your team equipped enough to manage costs and optimize costs in AWS or in your cloud environment? We recommend that you upskill your team through cloud economic training. Synthesis provides cloud economic training from introductory to advanced to executive training. And we've trained over 500 IT professionals in that area. The second is, and just to finalize that point, until your team is equipped to know how to manage and reduce costs, your bill will always really be too high. The second is around a well-architected framework review. The well-architected framework is an AWS-designed framework that guides you on how to build applications in cloud from a resilience, from a security, from an operational efficiency perspective, but from a cost management and optimization perspective too. These reviews will be run by a synthesis solution architect professional who can then guide you on how to build cost-effective applications, but also around the processes associated with the cost management and optimization. From a partner benefit perspective, we can provide you with POC credits to obviously reduce the expense of having to do a proof of concept. And AWS themselves have a whole host of different programs to either reduce your bill or assist with migrations and their best practices and expertise. Another thing I would focus on immediately is right-sizing your environment. Because cloud is scalable, i.e. you can scale up and scale down the environment based on demand, you should identify workloads in your environment that are not being used and stop them. In addition, you should identify things that aren't being utilized correctly and match the right EC2 instance and size so that you are matching supply and demand and correlating cost and value. Finally, on the right-hand side, we're looking at how applications should be built in the cloud. Applications that aren't designed correctly for cloud are generally pretty expensive to run on cloud, while applications designed inherently for cloud are usually pretty cost-effective. So fault tolerance, building things on containers or Kubernetes, etc. If one node dies, another one can just spin up. This means you can utilize spot instances. Scalability, we spoke about having the ability to scale up and scale down based on demand. And when demand's low, you scale down and you reduce costs. When demand scales up and goes up, then you're able to harness the benefit of increased customer usage or increased productivity of your end users. If you build cloud native, you're able to then really harness and embrace the higher level services like AWS Lambda or your managed service. This is a managed database service from AWS. And finally, around Open source, obviously the most frugal way of building things, and AWS really just makes that so easy. Okay, so quite a few of the guys today have spoken about what is resilience. Resilience in a time of a crisis. A lot of companies now have realized that their business continuity plans are just really not up to scratch. Asking the questions, can all your staff log in remotely? We've seen so many networks and VPNs just really not able to manage the sheer scale of the whole company logging in at once. Are your applications and processes designed for remote working? Call centers and bank branches come to mind. Call centers, they can't really work from home because they require quite a lot of infrastructure, and the remote working doesn't work. While being in a call center doesn't work either, because they don't have the ability to have a 2-meter gap with the social distancing requirements. So it's really a big challenge there. Another question around, do you have an online portal that your customers can effectively engage with you? And I think the key word there is effectiveness. So those who've embraced that digital transformation are the ones that are looking at the opportunities associated with the pandemic and really trying to help and reach out to their customers. Those who haven't embraced this are trying to scramble to get things going and are realizing it's a little bit too late. The Ponemon Institute has gone in some way to define the cost categories associated with resilience and the breakdown and the impact to you. So obviously the top three and account for top two and account for most of it is around the lost revenue and business disruption. That's obviously like your whole IT system going down or like a pandemic. However, interestingly enough, more than a quarter of that bulk is around productivity, around IT productivity, user productivity. Now, if you aren't able to effectively get your staff to be productive, to be able to use the tools they require to do their jobs, there's a ton of waste associated with that. I suggest you take this list and really quantify what these mean in your own business context, and then create plans around it to mitigate against these risks, which are real serious risks. AWS in Cloud allows you to decentralize the way in which you store and process data, so you're not necessarily tied down to one location. Now let's put this in a context that we all currently know right now. Can you imagine each government around the world had a pandemic plan? You imagine the World Health Organization had a global integrated plan that they managed across the globe. Can you imagine that every 3 years a pandemic game day simulation was run by everyone around the world to simulate what would actually happen? Number one, we'd understand what the health impact was. Number two, we would know what the social impact is. And number three, we would definitely understand what the economic impact would be. Now think of your own business now. Do you know how you'd react to the next potential disaster? For example, an ecological disaster, political fallout, or the kind of the bad news Spain again scenario where we don't necessarily overcome Corona right now. And there is still not a vaccine for this and still to be tested thoroughly. So Corona is proof that you have to plan for some of these eventualities. A lockdown top tip is that resilience also means being secure. Fraudsters and hackers are taking this opportunity to expose all sorts of vulnerabilities. Please take security into account when doing these sorts of resilience and business continuity plans. The impact of Corona is really bad enough. You don't want a security incident over and above all of this. And finally, here's just some top tips around what you can do right now in terms of optimizing and cost management and being more aware of your cost spend. Automate as much as possible. Automate. Address the culture in your team and ensure it supports your vision. Explain to everyone the reasons for going to cloud and using it that resonates with the whole team. Allocate time in every single sprint for cost reviews and optimization. Develop a tool or adopt a costing tool, track utilization and spend. What can be measured can be controlled. And make sure you correlate cost and value. Thank you, everyone. Back to Howard for some questions.
All right. Thank you. In fact, what I'm going to do is, Jared, if you could bring back Mike, Tom, and Jake as well, because then what we can do is look at the questions from are we able to get 5 back, or do we have to imagine Jake? No, there we go. We do not have to imagine what Jake looks like. All right. So, unfortunately, Dr. Marburg is not. We did invite him to come back as well, but apparently, saving lives is more important than saving businesses. But you know what? That's between him and God. So he'll have to just deal with that. But no, seriously, we do have a lot of the questions. We've got all of the questions that you sent for Dr. Marburg. As I said earlier, every Sunday we conduct a Sunday podcast, the Synthesis Sunday podcast. We're going to ask those questions on there. You'll be able to find them on YouTube, on social media, on all Synthesis social media channels. So you'll be able to do that. The question, I guess, that, and I'm not sure who wants to take this, is we've been thrust into a world not of our asking. We couldn't have imagined 8 weeks ago or 10 weeks ago what this world will look like. There is the excitement about change. There's this tremendous fear around what our future could bring. But there's also almost a negativity around, obviously, the real issues that people are facing in their businesses and in their personal environments. How do you think we channel optimism, innovation, the excitement that any change brings, whilst at the same time dealing with some of the reality? I'm not sure who wants to take that question. Nobody. Yeah, can I ask you to go with that?
I think it's been proven that when faced with the choice of negative outlook or positive outlook, that the positive outlook trumps any other alternative. So yes, there are dire circumstances. Businesses are struggling. People are also struggling in their own individual capacity. And yes, there's extreme risk from a health perspective. But given the choice of remaining positive and optimistic, evidence has shown that it promotes a better outcome. And I think the positivity in the face of adversity rubs off on other people, and that sort of chain reaction, just in a family unit or in a work environment, can make a significant difference. So we're dealing with a pretty grey day up in Johannesburg. I don't know what the weather's like for some of our other viewers that are tuning in locally and abroad. I think we've got some people in Australia tuning in as well. But the weather is playing a little part, but I think positivity goes a long way. And yes, there are challenges, but at the same time, there's a lot that can be said for just focusing on those positive outputs and being able to take it forward.
Tom, if I can put this question to you, you've often spoken way before COVID-19. You and I have had, and I've heard you talking very, very often about the way the world is changing dramatically, how your children can't really relate in many ways to a world that you had. And we're not talking about somebody who was born in the 1950s. How does COVID accelerate this vision that I think that you've long had?
Yeah, I think it's awesome. Hey, and I think maybe linked to like the previous question is also for me, when I think about what should I do, or what should I tell people to do, is for me it's like look at the power of the individual. I think in like times like these, it's actually we have to focus on priority number one are the individuals. So if you're running a business, it's made up of a group of people, right? And you can't be focused on the success of your business if you're not focused on the success of each of those individuals on the ground. You know, whether the business succeeds or doesn't succeed is tragic, but the individuals must succeed, right? And so in a time like this, for me, it's like build those individuals, training, pivoting, figuring out how to be more creative, how to see opportunities, retool yourself, or whatever. Those are the important things. The organizations of the future will form after the fact, if that makes sense.
Jake?
Yeah, I think the first question that you launched off in terms of asked Mark, I think is a hell of a hard question. And I think one of the ways
I don't want to do easy questions.
Sure. I think one of the ways
I didn't see that.
is you understand dealing with anxiety, because I think that's what people are feeling. They're feeling a heightened sense of anxiety. And I think just from a psychological point of view, when you start moving forward, i.e. just make small steps. So one of the things you have to do is shrink your time frame. Don't try and think about next month, next year. You're not when you're in a high state of anxiety, you can't do that. So try and shrink your time frame. Deal with now. Deal with today. What can I do today to start moving forward? And actually practically, maybe it's clean up my room, get my office in shape, make it look nice. Maybe clean up the bookshelves behind me, type idea. But basically start doing little things. But I think as you start taking little steps forward and you start doing something productive, what actually happens is your brain actually produces the right sort of chemical elements like dopamine, etc. And you start feeling more positive. You start actually saying, all right, I can start doing this. And then once you started doing something, you can then start doing the next thing. And then you can start expanding your time horizon. So my suggestion is don't freeze, don't just be in fear. Start doing something, start moving forward, start making little plans, show that you've got some control in your life, and then start actually expanding your time horizon and actually working out from there. But again, to echo Tom, if you sort out the people, you're sorting out a hell of a lot of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, whilst you were talking, I was thinking of that poem, which I've just found. It says, start now, start where you are, start with fear, start with pain, start with doubt, start with hands shaking, start with voice trembling, but start. Start and don't stop. Start where you are with what you have. Just start. And I think that's the message, right?
That is the message. What can I do now? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Do something, Darren. As a solutionist, which is for those who don't understand the term, effectively you look at a business problem and you solve the you address that problem through various disciplines. The situation that's developed around COVID-19 obviously must present companies across the board with all sorts of very, very real challenges. Can you talk to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, first off, I think we need to start listening more effectively to the experts. The corona pandemic, while a surprise to most of the world, health experts have been warning about something like this in the future. So I wouldn't say that there was a completely unexpected event. I think for businesses, we need to double down on a lot of important stuff like your values, like your company values, and what's more important. On a personal perspective, we need to double down on spending more time with our families, doing things we haven't done before. I know most of us who work from home have found that working from home means working much, much more. But it does mean that we are able to spend our time more with our family, do stuff with our kids that we don't necessarily do, have more time to watch Netflix or relax with our girlfriends or wives, or just do stuff around the house you don't necessarily do. Like it's autumn in South Africa at the moment, so there are a ton of leaves in the garden. Raking leaves over the weekend is something, and something you can turn into something interesting. Get your kids to make collages with the leaves and trees and stuff like that. So I think the first and foremost to understand is, what is the problem before you can solve anything. You have to identify what the problem is. And I think at the moment, the biggest problem we face is that as humans, we're not used to communicating online like this all the time. It's unnatural. It's uncomfortable sitting in a chair with headphones the whole time, sitting in a room on your own. You're not allowing your kids to come into the room because you have an important presentation. They can't watch TV because they're going to impact. They're going to mess up the bandwidth and stuff. It's the communication aspects. I think is the biggest challenge, and I think that's the problem we should focus on the most.
In fact, that's interesting because it goes to what Tom was saying earlier, is that we need to make peace with the fact that we do live in houses and homes that are imperfect, and there are children that are run in and out of the room, and maybe sometimes our bandwidth will be a bit slower because they are playing Call of Duty online with their friends. And I think that's really what we have to be comfortable with, right? Yeah. We unfortunately do have to wrap. There are a number of questions. Let me. In fact, we've got two more questions that I'll ask, and unfortunately, we will have to wrap after that. Do you see a clear line between family time and work, especially when you have little kids? This is a recurring problem. Mike, if you can talk to that.
Yeah, so I think Jake gave some excellent practical advice around work from home habits, and Tom also showed that hysterical video that aired on BBC many years ago, and that's now the new normal. So I think navigating between having that schedule and creating that workspace and creating that boundary is something that's advised, but at the same time, everyone is in the situation. So people do have a lot of tolerance, and I think embrace it. And if one of the kids comes in during a video call, I think it is appropriate, obviously depending on the audience and importance of the presentation. But by and large, I think most times it's acceptable to pause, even bring the kid into the video, make them part of the experience, and the audience will certainly understand. So it's a challenge, but be authentic, be honest, try to create the boundary, try to remain productive. But working from home throws out curveballs, and we have to deal with them.
Absolutely. Final question I want to ask every one of you. Do you think, Tom, is South Africa ready for what it needs to be ready for in terms of technology and business at the end of April 2020?
Yes, 1,000% we are ready.
Jake?
I think there are pockets of readiness. I think there are other pockets, maybe not that much.
That need some work. Darren, your view?
Well, South Africans are resilient people, so I'm hopeful.
All right, and finally, Michael.
Yeah, Jake did touch on it. I think we have a real dual economy, and while for some it's quite easy to continue homeschooling, for others, access to bandwidth, access to technology is not as ubiquitous. And I think corporate South Africa is stepping into the fold, and we have infrastructure that's ready, but at the end user and in certain economic pockets, we're not. So we will face a lot more trials and tribulations, but as we discussed earlier, being positive, being inventive, I think will help us navigate through this difficult time, and we're not alone. In fact, the whole world is stepping along this path with us.
Absolutely right. Time has just gone. It is just before 5 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you to our presenters, to our panelists for your work, your engagement in this, and thank you for participating. As Mike said earlier, we've had people tuning in from literally all around the world, certainly all around South Africa. I hope it was informative. I hope it gave you some measure of of what is possible out there at a time that is a difficult time for just about the whole world. I'm Howard Feldman. This has been your Synthesis Symposium. Thank you for joining us. Be safe and be kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.